Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fifth in the National Archives online lecture series for 2021. My name is Elizabeth McAvoy, and I'm the Archivist with responsibility for education and outreach in the National Archives. And on behalf of the office, we're delighted to welcome you here tonight, and also to welcome our guest speaker, Brian Donnelly, who will present on dismantling the poor law system in Ireland in the early 20th century. But before we begin, I'd just like to go through a few housekeeping details so that you can engage with our event. Audience cameras are off and mics are on mute, but we encourage your active participation in tonight's talk using the webinar's Q&A function. Brian's talk will run for roughly 45 minutes, with about 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. You'll have the opportunity to submit your questions during the talk, so please type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of the control panel, as both the chat box and the raise hand functions are disabled. We'll accommodate as many questions as time permits, so apologies in advance if we don't get around to answering yours. We're recording this webinar and we'll make it available on our website shortly, as we've already done with all previous online evening lectures since February. We'll also be live tweeting the talk, so please like or retweet our posts at NA or Ireland. So a few words about this evening's talk. During the height of the War of Independence, those Irish local authorities which recognised Dáil Éireann initiated the dismantling of the poor law system by closing many of the workhouses around the country, which had been set up from the late 1830s onwards. This was an extraordinary and unprecedented development and involved the deconstruction of an entire infrastructure. It was a decision which was motivated by ideology and financial expediency and had far-reaching implications, both for the people these institutions served and the communities in which they were located. In this evening's talk, Brian will explain how this came about and what the long-term consequences were for Irish society in the first half of the 20th century. So a little bit about our speaker this evening. Brian Donnelly began working for the Irish Manuscripts Commission in 1982 as a surveyor of business records, a role which involved locating, reporting on, and arranging the preservation of archives of historical interest. He became an archivist in the National Archives in 1993 and is senior archivist in the Public Services Division. Brian has worked over the years on the records of many workhouses, as well as those of their successors, the county homes, and has also written extensively on the transformation of the Irish health infrastructure during the 20th century. Such as Brian's knowledge of the poor law and workhouse system in Ireland, I think it's fair to say that if there's anything he doesn't already know about the subject, it's simply not worth knowing. I'll now hand over to Brian to discuss dismantling the poor law system in Ireland. Over to you, Brian.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for attending this talk. So over the next 45 minutes or so, what I hope to do is give you an insight into what happened during the couple of years in the early 1920s when the old workhouse system was dismantled. It's a forgotten episode to a great extent. But it was a heroic episode, and it had profound effects on the Irish social services for the remaining years of the 20th century. Now, as Liz pointed out, I work in the National Archives, and over the years I have worked with many collections of workhouse material and material relating to county homes. And I've been involved in a couple of surveys in the 1990s and most recently in 2015 that try to locate records relating to these institutions. But something on the medical infrastructure that existed before the Poor Law. You had a system of county infirmaries established from 1765. So each county would have an infirmary, probably a smallish institution with relatively few beds. But it was the beginnings of a public health service. Also, a public asylum system was established from 1814. In 1814, the Richmond Asylum opened in Dublin. Initially, it served the whole of the country. But as time went on, an infrastructure of mental hospitals were established. By 1871, 22 asylums were in operation around the country. There was a system of dispensaries established in rural areas from 1805. There were 450 in existence by the early 1830s. These dispensaries were supported partly by grants from the local authorities of the time, the grand juries, and partly by local subscriptions. And in those areas where you didn't have a resident gentry, sometimes because subscriptions weren't available to the same extent as they would be in more prosperous areas, the actual network of dispensaries wasn't as strong, particularly out in the west of Ireland. You had a system of fever hospitals established through the country from 1807. And these generally were small institutions with a few beds. Sometimes the government intervened directly if there was a major epidemic, such as the cholera epidemic of 1832. The government set up a cholera board and gave out grants to local committees in local areas. This is a photograph here of the county infirmary in Carrigan-Shannon, and as you can see, it's a fine structure. Most of the county infirmaries disappeared in the early 20s, around the time of the amalgamation schemes that abolished the poor law unions. I mentioned the development of an infrastructure of mental hospitals. This is St. Bridget's in Ballinasloe. And this was formerly known as the Connacht Asylum, one of the early asylums established in 1833. And the records of this institution are in the National Archives, and they date right back to 1833. The records of the county infirmaries have a very poor survival rate, partly because a lot of them went in the 20s. But there's a very good collection for Monahan, a very good collection of county infirmary records. So the Irish Poor Law of 1838, well, it was a response to the situation of the poor in Ireland. 163 workhouses were eventually built, mainly in the late 1830s and the 1840s. Some counties, like Carlow, had one workhouse. Larger counties had more. County Cork had 17. They were originally built to accommodate 1% of the population, or 80,000 people. each workhouse was at the centre of an area known as a poor law union, and each union was administered by a board called the Board of Guardians. And this is a typical picture of a typical workhouse. And if you pass through a town and see a workhouse, you know, you'll know it if you examine this drawing thoroughly. You know, the features are very distinctive. You know, the gable ends of the building. At the front, there's an administration building, and on the top floor of the administration building, the Board of Guardians met. And then there's a girls' yard at the front on the left and a boys' yard on the right. And there's a long building there which would have contained the girls' schoolrooms and boys' schoolrooms and dormitories up above. And at the end, those buildings at the end, they would have housed accommodation. And the other later part of the building, that long spine that's running there, would have been the dining room, and it would have served as a church. And to the right is the men's yard, and to the left is the women's yard. And then that long set of buildings at the back would have included an infirmary and an idiot ward. Of course, that was a technical term used at the time. People who are intellectually disabled. The workhouses would have had people who are mentally ill and people who are intellectually disabled, as well as other inmates. So generally, the workhouses, they followed this pattern, and sometimes surviving remnants, most of the building is gone, and only the front building actually survives. But they're quite readily identifiable. This is a map dating from 1838. And it shows the North Dublin Union building in the bottom right-hand corner. It's from the Grange Gorman area of Dublin City. And you can see it was an area that was heavily institutionalized. You have the workhouse down in the right-hand corner. To the left of it, you have the Richmond District Lunatic Asylum. This is the asylum that opened in 1814 and is now part of a network of asylums. And then there on top, you have the Richmond Female Penitentiary, And now this is 1838. The Poor Law Act was that year. Why are these buildings there? And they're there because they were originally part or used by the Dublin House of Industry, which was established in 1772 and was like an 18th century version of a workhouse. And when the Poor Law came in, the North Dublin Union utilised some of the buildings as workhouse buildings. There were two workhouses in Dublin City, the North Dublin Union and the South Dublin Union, which was on the south side of the river. The South County Dublin was covered by the Rathdrum Union, which also covered part of North Wicklow, and North County Dublin was covered by Balrothry Union. And actually these three institutions here, the workhouse, the asylum and the prison, we have records relating to all of them in the National Archives. Now, this is an interesting book here, an admission register for a workhouse. And this relates to the Rathdrum workhouse that covered South County Dublin and North County Wicklow. And unusually, good runs of these indoor registers, which list the names and details of people entering the workhouse, survive for the Dublin unions, the North and South and Rathdrum. Unfortunately for Balrotherry, only the minutes survive. So you can see this is the sort of book which was later used, in a modified form by the county homes later on. You get the names of the person. John Hayes is the first person mentioned. He's male, he's 12. And his mother, it was on the previous page at 2080. He's no employment or calling. He's a Roman Catholic and he's delicate, And you can see Mary Johnson there. Yes, female, 24. She's the child. She has a child as well, and they mentioned the number of the child, and she's a servant. So great details about individuals coming into the workhouse. Now, unfortunately, outside Dublin, the indoor registers don't have a great survival rate. But there are odd runs surviving, And on the other side of that that page, you get details, observations or name of wife or husband, and observations on the condition of the pauper when they were admitted, and there's usually something clean or dirty, or whether they have a fever, and the electoral division and townland in which they're resident, which is useful for genealogical purposes, if you're trying to trace a relative, the date they were born, admitted in the workhouse, and also the date when they died or left the workhouse. So the workhouse infrastructure, of course, was swamped by the Great Famine. And on the night of the 30th of March, 1851, over 250,000 people, or 1 in 26 of the population of Ireland, were paupers, receiving indoor relief either in workhouses, auxiliary workhouses, or workhouse hospitals. Now, while there was no provision for outdoor relief, this is relief outside the workhouse. It might be food or some other relief. Under the original Poor Relief Act, the pressure of famine conditions led the government to authorise guardians to give outdoor relief to certain specified classes. And here we have an example, again, it's from Rathdrum, of an outdoor relief register, and this is a list of people who are getting outdoor relief. And one of the things, this is from 1871, one of the things you notice is most of them are women, and many of them are widows. And these were people who are particularly vulnerable, when perhaps a husband died, a breadwinner, and widows and children, And, it wasn't until the 1930s, actually, that widows' pensions actually came in. So you can see the guardians assisting these particularly vulnerable sections, and a lot of information about these people, their names, their ages, their employment or calling, the names of their wives or husbands, where they're from, and the townlands in which they're resident. So now the boards of guardians, now they ran the workhouses, and their membership possessed an element based on a rated occupier franchise. Some ratepayers were elected, and some termed ex officios were appointed from the highest justices of the peace presiding in the county. The more prosperous rural population was introduced to representative local government through these boards of guardians, you know, so farmers who paid you know, the correct amount of rates could serve as guardians. Highly rated occupiers were given multiple votes, and each union was maintained by a poor tax or a poor rate, a tax levied in the main on the owners of property. And the poor law system was centrally controlled by poor law commissioners, later called the Local Government Board. Here you have a photograph from the early 70s of the dismantling of Rathdrum Union Workhouse building. And you can see this is the front administrative building, and those three windows in the middle, that's where the guardians met. That's where the guardians would have met. Now, after the famine, because the poor law system was centralised, they were given many more functions. In 1851, the old dispensary system that the grand juries had operated was placed under the poor law unions. Now, dispensary doctors were made registrars of births and deaths in 1863. So from actually the 1st of January 1864, accurate records were kept about who has been born and who was dying. And compulsory vaccination of children against smallpox began in the early 1860s as well. Smallpox was a terrible killer and blinded children, you know, and did terrible damage. And it was eventually eradicated by the late 19th century through vaccination. The workhouses had infirmaries attached to them. So these hospitals were officially opened to the non-destitute poor from 1862. So they were like public hospitals. Orphan and deserted children could be boarded out from 1862. Now that meant that instead of having the children in, in savoury atmosphere in the workhouse, they were sent to a family, and the family were paid to look after them, you know. So it was thought, and of course they were right, that it was better that the children should be brought up in a healthy family atmosphere. And another development was that nuns were allowed to act as nurses in the workhouses from 1861. And by 1903, they were employed in 85 workhouses. But the declining population after the famine meant that workhouse populations declined. And just I mentioned the workhouse hospitals and the infirmaries. Here's an extract. I think this is from Balrothery in North Dublin in the 1890s, and you can see a list of people who are dying. And they were on the medical books on Saturday last. In the lunatic cells. Now, that's interesting that they refer to them as cells, the places where these mentally ill people were kept. There were 66 people. In the infirmary, there were 119, and in the fever hospital, there were 11. So there were 196, almost 200 people in the various hospitals, you know. And you can see, we recommended an inmate named William Dodd be sent to a hospital in order to have a surgical operation, you know, and so that was agreed. The master, who was the manager of the workhouse, reported that the children of both schools were out for recreation during the week. So the workhouses, because there were children in them, they would have had schools, you know. So an interesting little insight into the operation of the Balrothery in the late 1890s. And this is a record of deaths of people in a workhouse hospital. This is Rathdrum in 1890. And you can see that most people are relatively young who are dying. There's one man in his age 85 who died of general decay. But it's interesting to see what people are dying of. Phthisis. that second entry, that's a form of tuberculosis, you know, marasmus. The sixth entry there, poor old Patrick Byrne, 9 months, he dies of marasmus. That was a sort of a weakening of the system, usually in children. It often had to do with, you know, the lack of nutrients or an ability to take in nutrients, you know. So you can see there's quite a lot of phthisis. And a poor man, James Doyle, age 40, he's died of tetanus, you know. And also around the 1890s, you know, you find a lot of men dying of cancer of the mouth, you know, and this must have been from pipe smoking or chewing tobacco. And that's the other side of that particular page, and it gives the profession of the people. The poor little child who died of marasmus was a deserted child, you know, from Bray, you know. But again, interesting information, you know. So the workhouse hospitals, you know, it was a place to go. You know, if your health was in decline and you couldn't get into any other institution, you know. Also, even though the workhouses, you know, had declining populations or were half empty, they were still quite important economically for local areas. And here is it's a notice from Bourne Boy Union. Coal wanted, the 1901, you know. Bourne Boy, you know, it's a smallish village in the north of Cavan, and the workhouse was up in a hill overlooking the town, very important as far as the town was concerned. And unfortunately, after amalgamation, Bourne Boy was one of the places that closed, and the village was a big loser in that regard. There are some photographs of inmates. Here is a lady. This is a photograph taken about 1907. This lady, she was from Kilmechanic in County Wicklow, and she ended up in the Richmond Asylum, where they took photographs of patients from the 1890s. And this lady had been in the Rathdrum workhouse, and maybe that's why her hair is cut. And she was quite old at this point in time, born in 1811, you know. And they took a picture of her there. Obviously, she's in her bed. You know, she was quite well cared for by the asylum staff, but her bones had become very tender, you know, and fragile, and she started suffering fractures, you know. This is another photograph here. Again, the proximity of the Richmond District Asylum to the workhouse meant that you know, if the mentally ill people in the workhouse, if their situation deteriorated, they were sent to the asylum. There was a constant stream of people coming in. So attempts to reform the workhouse system. The Vice-Regal Commission on Poor Law Reform was set up in 1903 and reported in 1906. It recommended that the workhouse system be abolished and poverty should be addressed through the development of the country's resources, and various classes of inmates should be segregated into separate institutions, not have them all, you know, in one institution, unmarried mothers and mentally ill and the intellectually disabled and the able-bodied. And they also suggested the infirm should be removed from the workhouses to county almshouses. And a Royal Commission on Poor Laws in 1909 was in agreement with this 1906 Vice-Regal Commission. But apart from the closure of a very small number of workhouses, nothing happened. And this is an example here of, you know, the situation in the workhouses just before they were closed. Here we have Tubbercurry Poor Law Union, a report by an inspector on the school there. And when he visited the place in 1921, he found there were only 4 pupils. They were all infants on the rolls of the school. And they say they're making good, fair progress. And the teacher seems to be kind and sympathetic with them. The schoolroom was cleanly kept, but they were paying a teacher teacher just to look after 4 people. And of course, his reports stated this school should have been closed down long ago. You know, of course, they thought it was a bit of a waste of money having a teacher with only 4 pupils. You know. Also here, this is a return from the Killarney Union in December 1920, and you know, gives details of the number of people in the union. So the total number of people in the workhouse was 193, and this Polo Union had been built for 800 people, you know. So the workhouses, ridiculously, these huge buildings, networks of buildings, having such a small number of people, you know, in them, you know. Now, when Dáil Éireann met on the 21st of January 1919, it's stated in its democratic programme that they realised the necessity of abolishing the odious, degrading and foreign Polo system and substituting a sympathetic native scheme for the care of the nation's aged and infirm, who shall no longer be regarded as a burden, but rather entitled to the nation's gratitude and consideration. And they said it should be the duty of the Republic to take measures that will safeguard the health of the people and ensure the physical and moral well-being of the nation. And in the 1920 local elections, which were the first local elections to be held since 1914, many local authorities, Sinn Féin representatives were elected to them. And the first thing they did was they recognised Dáil Éireann as the legitimate government. As a result, they were refused grants and subsidies from the British government, and also they became liable for criminal injuries sustained during the War of Independence. They were soon in financially straitened circumstances. Economies had to be made with regard to roadworks, asylum administration, the workhouse infrastructure. And here we have an example. This here is the Kenmare Board of Guardians, and on the 30th of September 1920, that from this date forward, this Board of Guardians and Rural District Council hold no further communication with the British Local Government Board. You know, so this allegiance would have been pledged all over. Certainly the south of Ireland, where there were Sinn Féin dominated boards, but of course the Polo unions became. We're now at the front line during the War of Independence, and here's an extract from the minutes of proceedings of the Board of Guardians of Carrigan-Shore, and they're complaining about the arrest of their clerk. We strongly protest against the arrest in his office in discharge of his duty of our respected clerk, Mr. Morris Hickey, for, as we understand, having in his office documents from the local government department, you know, of Dáil Éireann, you know. So local officials, members of the Board of Guardians, rate collectors, they were all pursued and sometimes arrested and imprisoned by the British military authorities, you know. And also, you know, the political nature of these boards, this is a reference to the Portumna Board of Guardians at their meeting supporting a circular relating to the Belfast Boycott. And this in August 1920, Catholics, when they were driven from the shipyards. So a boycott was organised, and this was circulated to all the local authorities down here through the General Council of County Councils, and Portumna here is supporting the Belfast boycott. Many workhouses were burned. Here's, or otherwise occupied, Dunmanway in County Cork, occupied by the auxiliaries during the War of Independence. Later became a cottage hospital, you know, in the 1930s. So the amalgamation scheme superfluous workhouses were closed, the staff were pensioned off, county institutions were set up, county homes, county hospitals, district hospitals. There were great variations in the effects of amalgamation. In Galway, 10 workhouses were replaced by one county home, one county hospital and a children's home. In Louth and Carlow, the number of institutions remained the same. In Dublin City, the North Dublin Union Workhouse was closed in 1918. It was supposed to be turned into a barracks, and it was amalgamated with the South Dublin Union Workhouse, which became the Dublin Union. So we have a series of files, Dáil Éireann local government, and gives a great insight into how the various local authorities try to deal with amalgamation. And this is a circular letter that the county secretary of the Cork County Council is sending out about amalgamation. This is a series of documents relating to a conference that the several boards of guardians within the county of Cavan had with regard to amalgamation, you know. And you can see here's Bone Boy, Mr. Michael Bannon stated that the accommodation of his workhouse was for 550, the general average number of patients being 40. He was and he says, you know, in the event of the workhouse being closed, of the 23 patients chargeable to Cavan County, he estimated 10 were as likely to transfer. The remainder would probably seek accommodation with friends or relatives, you know. So not everybody in the workhouse was prepared to actually go to these larger institutions, you know. And it was interesting there, they set up a subcommittee, and after an hour, they perfected a scheme that they decided to submit, an amalgamation scheme. Here is the old workhouse in Athy. Now St. Vincent's Hospital, and it's incredible the longevity of some of these institutions, you know, opened in the early 1840s and still, you know, serving the community, you know, in the 2020s. Here is the union in the Sacred Heart Hospital in Roscommon. Again, still in use by the HSE, and still in very good condition. This is an example of a printed amalgamation scheme pamphlet from County Wicklow. And these pamphlets give details of what they're going to do, what institutions are going to close. And in Wicklow, they were going to close various workhouses with 336 inmates costing £19,278 and replace them with a county home with 300 patients costing £10,550. So that was a saving of over £8,000. You know, so there were big savings involved in closing these institutions. Here we have Shillelagh Puro Union, another village that lost out under the amalgamation scheme. Shillelagh was closed. But of course, when these institutions were closed, the staff had to be pensioned off. And here, again, from these records we hold in the National Archives, the records of the Dáil Éireann local government, we have the form that was filled in for Margaret Deegan, who was a nurse in the Fever Hospital in Shillelagh Workhouse, giving various details. And also stated, this is a note by the medical doctor, stating that she had caught diphtheria twice, was recovering from the effects of paralysis, and had also suffered from typhus fever, and that this had undermined her health. And she was given a pension of £75 a year, but she was 55 years old at that point in time. I don't know, I suppose, the average life expectancy might have been around 60. Also, the children in the workhouse, this was an important element of the amalgamations. They try to move as many children out as possible, and this is a file which states that the department had noted in Carlow that there were a lot of children there, and they want them placed in suitable homes at a much smaller cost than is now incurred in training them up as undesirables. That means leaving them in the workhouse, you know, and here again, the Dáil Éireann local government material, we have a return from one of the relieving officers of children at nurse, and you can see there's the name of the child, who they're placed with, their residence, the date of the previous inspection. This is an inspection by the relieving officer to make sure that they're healthy and clean and that they're attending school regularly. So the burden of the rates, you know, was another important factor in these amalgamation schemes. There was an economic collapse in 1920 after the First World War. Farm labourers resented that their wages hadn't kept pace with wartime inflation, and farmers were alarmed at the increasing militancy of labourers. And in Wexford, more extreme elements of these farmers' associations, which farmers organised, suggested that a farmers' freedom force be established to combat what they called labour socialism and Bolshevism. And this is a letter from the County Carlow Farmers Association, and they're complaining about the level of the rates. Mr. Broughton, you know, he's the secretary, and he's demanding an investigation into the accounts of the Carlow workhouse, you know, and the department have sent him a quick letter stating that that in the estimates for Carlow Union, it's not considered to be unreasonable, the estimate for the rates, and that the current rate of 10 shillings does not compare favourably with that in other union areas. So there's this constant battle between the ratepayers and those who need to be supported by the system, you know. And there, of course, the moving of people will cause major trauma, you know, and this is a letter from Cork, one of the department's inspectors. He's talking about moving people from the infirmary at Macroom to Cork, and he's saying, I think an effort should be made to move them on stretchers if possible in a motor ambulance. They would not be able to sit up in a railway carriage after being bedridden for years. So it's quite traumatic for many of the patients been moved. So there was a report of the Commissioners on the Relief of the Poor in 1927, and one thing that they pointed out about the amalgamation schemes was that many of them, the provision of just one home to replace a whole lot of workhouses only for the aged and infirm has caused hardship. An auxiliary provision for these classes, or the most feeble of them, is necessary. And here we have the county home, the Galway County Home in Loughrea, and this home, served a county that had contained 10 workhouses, you know, and only 3 of them were utilised afterwards. One is a county hospital and one is a children's home, the Tomb Children's Home. But so people were transported from this huge county to Loughrea from the other workhouses to Loughrea Workhouse. And the ratepayers put up a terrible fight. The Department of Local Government and Health wanted a district hospital established in Clifton. And here we see the This is the Clifton Hospital, which eventually opened in 1935. It was helped with sweepstakes money, and of course another hospital opened in Port Yunkla in Ballinasloe in 1943. Again, this is a remnant of one of the workhouses, the front building of the Waterford Union, as it is now. The main workhouse was demolished in the 1980s, So comparative statistics. In 1913, you had over 26,000 people in institutions. In March 1925, 18,000. Persons on outdoor relief or home assistance. In 1913, you had 14,000. In 1925, a big jump, 21,000. And the number of children boarded out was relatively much the same, a little over 2,000 in 1913 and over 2,000 in March 1925. So the boards of guardians were abolished and county homes were established, and county boards of health and public assistance. They replaced the boards of guardians, and the number of public representatives in a county involved in administering the public health, relief and housing services declined from about 150 to 10. That was the number of the boards of health and public assistance. And so county infirmaries and their committees were abolished, except in Dublin, Cork, Limerick, Waterford, Kildare, Meath, Westmeath and Louth. And the committees and management of all the county fever hospitals were abolished during the amalgamation schemes. And that's the Board of Health and Public Assistance in Wicklow in the 1930s. Say it was like a committee of the county council, but they had a statutory standing of their own. Just a few photographs here of what happened afterwards. Here's the district hospital in Baltinglass, opened in 1931, and you can see part of it is a workhouse building and part of a relatively modern building. The workhouse had been burned during the Civil War. This is Abbey Leaks District Hospital, beautiful hospital built with sweepstakes money in the 1930s on the old workhouse site. This is an interesting photograph of Mill Street Workhouse. The workhouse had burned. A lot of the Cork workhouses had been burned during the War of Independence. And the front building was built in the 1930s. And the back building there was the old workhouse fever hospital buildings. And that's it now. That's one of the outlying buildings. That's obviously the original Polo building. That is the front administration building in Loughrea, and a lot of these administration buildings survive. That's St. Columbkille's Hospital, the old Rathdrum Union. And in the 1980s, under the roof was found the greatest collection of poor law records, that was ever discovered in Ireland, and they're in the National Archives now. Some workhouses are still utilised as very modern hospitals. South Tipperary General Hospital that was a huge workhouse originally, the Clonmel Workhouse. This is the workhouse in Mount Mellick, and there's an interesting story associated with this. James Deany, who was the chief medical officer, he recounts, he wrote a great autobiography, and in the 1940s, he talks about, it was during the emergency, he was passing through Mount Mellick and he decided to call into the county home, and the matron was doing her rounds. She was a nun, and she was making sure that the patients, were getting into bed. And he noticed one of the patients, he had his arms vertically, as he lay in the bed, and the matron had to press his hands, and put them under the covers. There was some nightly ritual. And then he noticed there were these electric razors hanging around. And he said, where did you get those? The department certainly weren't supplying them. And she was very embarrassed, and she had to admit that she had bought them, and what she'd been doing was, when the men got their pensions, some of them went out for a drink, and she was always sending search parties out trying to find people who'd fallen down. So she bought a drink and set up sort of a shebeen in the county home, and served it, or sold it to the men. And the profit she made, she bought them things like razors, and she was worried that she was going to get into trouble. But Dini encouraged her in this, Now, of course, the poor county homes, they were the Cinderellas of the public institutions, and there was a documentary made about Rathdrum in the late 1960s, a radio program which made mention of the fact that meals were, had to be served cold because they had to be carried up down corridors and upstairs, and the building was in a very dilapidated state. And the county manager was interviewed, and he admitted, he said, well, we spent our money on housing. We spent our money on roads. In the old days, roads gave a lot of employment. Sewerage schemes, they gave employment as well. They were labour intensive. And he admitted the county homes were, at the back of the queue. And you can see there, the beds are fairly close together. Pretty Spartan. So the county home in Rathdrum, the old workhouse building was eventually demolished, and a new county home was established, or a new hospital opened for the care of the elderly, in 1975 there, So just something about the records. I mentioned the North and South Dublin Union, really great runs of records, and the Rathdown Union, the best collection of records. Also Balrothery, we have in the National Archives. Also, we have a couple of good collections of county home records. The records of St. John's Hospital in Sligo, formerly the Sligo County Home. It contains registers of admission, and also some indoor registers of the workhouses that were placed, and some other records. And we also have some surviving records of St. Brendan's Hospital in Rockray, formerly the Galway County Home, that institution that catered for that huge county, and formerly there had been 10 county homes. That collection includes some registers of admission and also other records, So I hope this talk was in some way informative, and certainly I'll be glad to answer any questions you might have, with regard to it.
Brian, thank you very, very much for that talk. That was absolutely terrific. I must say the story, the anecdote about the nun running the shebeen, I'm glad to see that she was encouraged, actually, instead of possibly disciplinary action being taken against her. And also just how it's a cliche, but how those photographs tell 1,000 words. To be able to see the photographs of some of the inmates in the workhouses is absolutely incredible. Brian, we have a couple of questions here. Okay, Brian, could I just ask you to stop sharing your screen for a second? Sure. Thank you very much. Great stuff. Thank you. Okay, so we have, a fascinating talk. Brian, many thanks. Thank you very much from Aileen Wynne. A question from Pat Flaherty. Is there a list of all the poor law unions and their locations during the 19th century? I'm guessing they're asking in the National Archives.
Oh, let me see. Well, I'm sure there is a list somewhere, but there may be one in the National Archives, but there may not be. Unfortunately, the records of the local government board that who succeeded the Polo commissioners, a lot of them were burned in 1922. But I'm sure printed maps must have been produced of the Polo commissioners, and a lot of the records we have, they would contain references to the Polo unions, but I couldn't say categorically. But I'm sure they do exist. I'm sure they do exist.
Fair enough, Brian. There's a question here in relation to the photographs. The person is asking, are all the people named in them? Can they be identified from the photos?
They can. They can. And actually, some of the photographs, there's a lot of information, attached to the person's file. That's one of the old lady who was in her 90s, who came from Rathdrum to the Richmond Asylum. She kept on claiming that she remembered 1798. And the resident medical superintendent, Connolly Norman, he got somebody to go to the public record office and check the 1851 census. And he found that she was 40 years old in 1851, according to her return. And there's a copy of her return actually on her file. But she kept on claiming she was 10 years old. But I think she was 10. That would have meant she was 10 years old in 1821, and there was a lot of trouble in County Wicklow. The rock ice troubles, and there would have been military going around, and people occasionally been killed in 1821, and that's probably what she was remembering when she was 10. But of course, later on in the century, she's looking back. She probably didn't know what age she was, and she thought that was 1798. But the poor woman actually. She died of dysentery actually in the Richmond. They terrible trouble with the sanitation there, but she was well into her 90s, well into her 90s.
The one of the pages you showed there, Brian, had a little baby. I didn't catch the name, and they have written in lived only 10 minutes after birth. So lines like that really, they're very poignant and very moving. They look on the face of it quite bureaucratic, but then you see mortality rates of children and of babies being so high. Brian, there's a question here. Was there a deliberate effort by Republicans to torch the workhouse records for fear of association with the poor law system and the stigma that was attached to it?
Well, that's a good question. Of course, there was a stigma attached to the institutions themselves, and I'm sure in the old days there was a stigma, attached to the records, but it may be one of the reasons why so few of the indoor registers actually survive. Maybe years ago, people thought, that they were a record of degradation, and these things were better forgotten. Perhaps that might have been an element, but of course, the other reason that so little survived, as well, may have been the amalgamation schemes themselves. The workhouses were abandoned, and of course, a lot of them, certainly in places like Cork, had been burned during the War of Independence, and others were burned in other parts of the country during the Civil War. But it may have been a factor. I suppose it's difficult to prove, but it may have been a factor. Yes.
Yeah, I suppose that might be something that might be borne out in newspaper articles if there was destruction of records or damage to the actual premises of the workhouse. There is somebody tuning in from Monahan who is saying here that residents would have been assigned to the Callan workhouse across the border in Kilkenny. And Adrian Donnelly is asking, you mentioned Monahan Asylum records. This gentleman's great-grandmother died there and is wondering how would they access those records, because we don't have Monahan Asylum.
No, we don't. But if they get onto the HSE. In Monahan, St. Avnet's, they're very good records, actually. They were one of the later asylums, Monahan, but there's a very good collection of records there.
There's a question here from a lady called Laura who's asking about, is access to any of the records restricted?
The workhouse records, there's no problem about access. Some of the material up to 1918 is available on microfilm. Records of the Dublin Union, which carried on from the North and South Dublin Unions. The admission registers are available up until they finish in 1938. But the minute books of the Board of Assistants that starts off in the 20s, I think it runs up until 1943 for the Dublin Union. You have to get permission to look at those because they might contain sensitive information, regarding boarding out of children, but if you're a relative, there's usually no problem, and the county home records we have, access to those would be through the HSE, through the HSE.
So. Through the HSE. Okay, there is a query. Thank you, Brian. Great talk. Should workhouse / county home / poor law union records not be stored rather in the respective local authorities rather than centralised in the National Archives in Bishop Street?
Well, I think yes. If the local authorities are able to provide a proper level of accommodation, my own opinion that would be preferable if they were taken locally. But of course, in terms of workhouse records, the vast bulk of what we have relates to the Dublin area anyway, but maybe one of the problems over the years has been that the local authority archive infrastructure is so underdeveloped, I'm sure in the long term, when there is a proper, yes, well, in some places I know there are proper archives, yes, these records probably would be better off made available locally, with of course the assent of people like the HSE, who would own some of them.
We'll take maybe 2 more questions if that's okay, Brian.
Sure.
You're happy maybe to take 2 more. I'm just conscious of time, and you've given such a terrific talk. There's a question from a lady here who is firstly thanking you for the talk and asking if records relating to County Mayo, I'm guessing she's talking about Mayo in the context of poor law records, available in the NAI.
I'm just trying to think relating to Mayo. I have a feeling the National Library took in poor law records relating to the west of Ireland in years ago. Now I'm not aware we have records relating to unions in the poor law unions in the west of Ireland. But we would have some records that would pertain to those unions. For example, we have a run of local government board orders from 1838, and these are orders made by the local government board and the poor law commissioners. If a poor law union wanted to maybe employ a midwife, they'd have to get an order order from the Poor Law Commissioners of the Local Government Board. So we have runs of those orders. And we have odds and ends, a few odds and ends for the 1840s letter books relating to the poor law system as well, but nothing very substantial,
Okay, I know this is a rather general question here, asking about what approach would you recommend for researching the poor law records for genealogy purposes? But presume I'll obviously let you answer that question, but it is quite a broad one.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think if the indoor registers survive, certainly a person would be mentioned. But I wouldn't lose hope entirely. If minute book survives, there's always a chance that somebody might be mentioned in minute books, and of course staff appointments, would be mentioned in minute books, or deaths of staff, so and things like the boarding out of children, they'd often be mentioned in the minute books, so even the absence of the indoor registers, there's still hope if the minutes survive.
And this is very much the final question, because this is a nice short one. Is there an online catalogue of the poor law collection at the National Archives?
I'm just trying to think that I'm sure that there are mention of them, but not a catalogue, but maybe it's something we could do, in the future. You'd have to come in and look at a list of the records of the North or South Dublin Union or the Rathdrum Union, and then you'd get a microfilm reference or a reference to the original record, from that list. But it's something, yes, we maybe could do in the future.
Sure. Well, look, Brian, on behalf of the audience, I would like to say thank you so much again for sharing your formidable knowledge of your subject with us tonight, for tuning in to the talk. And for engaging so actively with this topic. Our next online public talk will take place on the 27th of July, and it will focus on the Beyond 2022 project, in which the National Archives is a key participant. So please keep an eye on our Twitter account. We'll probably do a save the date tweet this week and open registration for next week. And that will be on the 27th of July. So again, thank you for tuning in. If you miss our next talk, wishing you all a very lovely summer and summer holidays. We will have a talk on the 27th of July. We will confirm whether we will have an August one closer to the time. But in the meantime, thanks again for joining us even. Wishing you all a very enjoyable evening. Gurv Mina Mahagurv August Slongafol. Thank you again, Brian.
Thanks, Liz. Thank you.